Welcome to Windows Presentation Foundation, Accessing Web Services with WPF. In this screencast, I'm going to show you how to invoke different types of web services from your WPF application. WPF applications enjoy the benefit of having full access to the .NET framework. This means that they can use a number of approaches when it comes to accessing web services. Typically, the approach that you take will be dictated or at least influenced by the type of service you want to reach. The .NET framework supports two types of services. The traditional web services we call ASP.NET Web Services, or ASMX, and the newer Windows Communication Foundation, or WCF services. For both types, there's functionality that's built into the platform and Visual Studio for creating a proxy to the service. For an ASMX web service, this functionality is supported by the Add Web Reference tool, and for WCF, similar functionality exists called Add Service Reference. Recently, there's been a trend towards RESTful services. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and since one of the principles of RESTful communication is reliance on simple HTTP calls, you can easily invoke RESTful services using the standard System.NET namespace from any .NET application, including WPF. Let's see a demo of how to invoke each type of service from a simple WPF application. Before we get to the WPF application, I'd like to point out the solution that contains the services. So this is just an ASP.NET web application that contains three different services of three different types. So the first is an ASMX web service, the second is a Windows Communication Foundation service, and the third is a second Windows Communication Foundation or WCF service that exposes its data via a RESTful API. So in all three cases, the data that's being exposed is a simple book search. So I can go ahead and test out the application, and what you'll see is that for the ASMX web service, the framework generates a sort of descriptor page, and I can go out and see the WSDL document, which is the web services descriptor language, and I can do that for both the ASMX service and for the WCF service. For the RESTful service, well, everything is done via straightforward HTTP. So the RESTful service you can actually use right from the browser. And in fact, there's an example of the type of URL that you would need. And so I can test it out simply by typing in something to search for in the titles of these books. And notice how this text box contents is going to be substituted for this query. And then when I click search, I'll get that same URL, and then I'll get a result here. And if I was to change this just by typing in the URL to say cooking, I'm going to get another result or another list of books. And you can see that this is just plain XML that's being returned to me. Okay, so let's leave this running and move over to the WPF application. Now I've already created the UI because that doesn't have anything to do with web services, so that way we have something to start with. And perhaps the only thing I want to really call your attention to is that we have some buttons that will allow us to invoke the services, and we have a list box that will allow us to display the results of the services or the service calls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by adding a reference to the ASMX web service. So I'll go over to this page and click on the ASMX web service, and then go to the service description, because it's this web service descriptor language document, or WSDL, that I really want. So I'll select and copy that, and then I'll return to the WPF application and select Add Web Reference. Now in some cases, especially if you're using Visual Studio 2008, the Add Web Reference option may not be visible. If it's not visible, then you simply select Add Service Reference, and from Add Service Reference select Advanced, and then Add Web Reference. Right. Now I can paste in the WSDL location and click Go. It will query the WSDL and then find out everything about that service, and then return with a list of methods, and I can add a web reference here. We'll go ahead and call it ASMX service just to make it clear. Click Add Reference, and now we have this proxy, which I can invoke from the code behind. So I will modify this event handler for the button, and we'll start by creating an instance of ASMX books, which is our service. Now all we have to do is call the no argument constructor. We don't have to supply the location or the port or anything else, because all of that is stored in the proxy and that was generated by the tool there. Now, this service is going to be have a method that returns an array of type book, and I chose to do it this way just to sort of demonstrate that we're not talking about services that just return things like primitive data types, but also services that expose and return and exchange complex data. So in this case, we have an object of type book that's going to contain title and author, and then we have an array of books that is returned by the call to system search books. The text box search parm is where we're getting the value from the user. So now we just invoke that and iterate through the results. Before we iterate through the results, I'm going to go ahead and clear out the list box. And now I'll add my for each. And everything in the result is going to be an object of type asmxservice.book. And now we can go ahead and invoke a little utility method that simply adds the book based on title and author to the list box. So at this point, I can go ahead and invoke this service, and let's say I wanted to do a search for, like before, cooking. I select search with ASMX, and I should get two values and title and author and whatnot. Okay. ASMX services are the precursor to WCF services, and you'll see that a lot of the functionality exposed by ASMX and the way that you add services is very similar, almost unchanged. If I switch over to our services page, I can select the WCF service. Again, go to the WSDL, copy the WSDL, and then return here, and this time I'll add a service reference, paste in the WSDL location, and click Go. The functionality is similar. The user interface and the dialogues are a little bit different. I can expand here to see the operations and so forth. And again, just as before, create a namespace. I will call it WCF Service. Now this next bit of code is going to be almost identical to the previous code, because we're still invoking a proxy, and so because the proxy is taking care of everything for us, actually invoking the proxy will look nearly the same. In fact, what I'll do is I'll copy this code and paste it over, and let's just replace this first line with, instead of a call to ASMX service, we'll use WCF service.WCF books client, and again we'll just call the empty argument constructor. I need to change the namespace, but because we're returning a list of books, an array of books, we still get a book type to work with. We just have to make sure it's the right book type, both here and here. And that's it. So the code is virtually the same. We're just using a different tool to generate the proxy. And now we should be able to execute the application again. And now let's try another search. This time let's go back to computer, search with WCF, and we should see the results. Whether we use WCF or ASMX, we should get the same results. Finally, there's the notion of a REST-based service. Well, a REST-based service, remember, this is something that's just in HTTP. So fortunately, regardless of whether it's actually being hosted by ASP.NET, as mine is, or maybe it's being hosted by PHP or Java or any number of technologies, we can get to it rather easily thanks to the fact that it's all using just straightforward HTTP. So what I'm going to need here is I'm going to need to copy the URL or the address, And then I'll go back to the event handler for the search REST button. And I'll start by defining or creating the string that represents the address. And I'll use string.format here so that I can actually substitute the query for the value of searchparm.text. This is 0 index, so now we've got the address that we're going to use. Next, I'm going to create an instance of web client. So this is the straightforward web.client or system.web.webclient, system.net.webclient actually. So I create an instance of that, and then I'm going to define an XML reader, because if you remember, the results of the REST service invocation, at least the one that I'm accessing here, the results come back as XML. So we'll start by creating an X reader or XML reader, and I'll create that with a call to XML reader create, which happens to take a stream. Well, a stream is exactly what I would expect from or what I get by invoking client.openRead and passing in the address. So now I've got my XML reader ready. Now I happen to be using link to XML to process the results. So because of that, I can just use xelement.load, and it takes an argument of type XML reader. So now I've got a single object that represents the XML coming back, and I can use this to query for the results, the resulting books. As before, I'll clear out the results, and then I'm going to do a for each, and this time we're going to iterate through the X elements, and I'll call them again book. If I retrieve X element book. Now I'm actually going to pause here because this won't work, and the reason it won't work has really nothing to do with web services so much as the way that XML and specifically link to XML works. If you recall, when I did a invocation here using the REST service, all of these were in a specific namespace, the namespace shown here. And if I was to ignore that, see if I can copy that, if I was to simply supply the value of book, it wouldn't match it up to the right namespace. So what I really need to do here is to create a few objects of type xName. So I'll call this xBook equals xName.get. We need the local element name and then the namespace name. And that's got to be enclosed by strings there. Actually going to do this a few times because I have 3 elements that I'm going to reference, and all of them are in that same namespace: book, title, and author. And now this allows me to just use xBook, and the results will I'll actually get results, as opposed to if I just searched for book as a string literal, I wouldn't get anything. So now I've got an XML element that represents just that node of the specific book, and I can use that along with those other xName objects instances I just created. Okay, book, and I want the title element, but I want the value associated with it, not the element itself. And I'll do the same thing for book.element for author value. And that's it. So it's certainly more code than if we had generated the proxy, but realize that instead of having a bunch of code generated for us that's happening behind the scenes, this is all the code that we need, because it's a simple, straightforward, HTTP-based RESTful service. Okay, so let's run the demo one more time. This time we can do a search. Let's search for sushi, and we'll search using the REST API, and we get a response. The same response if we use the REST API will still work if we search for computer or anything else. We get the same results regardless of which service we're using or which type of service, but we've just seen how to easily invoke 3 different types of services from WPF. Thanks very much for your time.